What's up?
One by one.
Mom! Mom!
Hold on, just relax.
Mom!
Just relax, Nathaniel.
Police took 3 family members into custody from their home in the village this week.
I gotta arrest someone.
Yep, you're Tamika, right?
How?
Just turn around for me, okay?
I'm trying to ask how.
The village police investigation started in July when DHS notified officers an intellectually disabled 18-year-old gave birth. Authorities could not determine who fathered the child.
It's July 2024 in a small hospital room in the village, Oklahoma. An 18-year-old girl lies in bed, clutching her newborn baby. Her face is blank, her eyes distant. Nurses hover around her, asking questions she can't fully answer. "Who is the father?" they ask gently. She hesitates, her voice barely a whisper. "My boyfriend," she says, but when pressed for details, she stumbles. She can't remember his last name. She can't describe where he lives. She can't even explain how they met. The nurses exchange uneasy glances. Something is very, very wrong. Minutes later, police are called. A DNA test is ordered. And when the results come back, what they uncover is so disturbing, so vile, that even seasoned investigators are shaken. This wasn't just a teenage pregnancy. This wasn't a mistake. This was years of silence, a house full of secrets, and a family that did nothing to stop it. Welcome to True Crime Intel. I'm Williams, and today we're diving into the chilling case of the Molden family, a story that will leave you questioning how something so horrific could happen right under everyone's noses. The Molden family lived in the village, Oklahoma, a quiet, unassuming suburban town just outside Oklahoma City. From the outside, their home looked like any other on the block. A modest single-story house with a neatly trimmed lawn, it blended seamlessly into the rows of similar homes. But inside those walls, behind closed doors, something dark was festering. Something no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. Nathaniel Molden Sr., the father, was a man of few words. To his neighbors, he was quiet, reserved, even unremarkable. He worked a steady job, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. But those who knew him better would tell a different story. Behind the privacy of his home, Nathaniel Sr. was controlling, even volatile. He ruled the household with an iron fist, setting strict rules for his children and demanding obedience. Old police reports hinted at domestic disturbances, calls that never led to formal charges. Some described him as a man with a temper, someone who could snap at any moment. Others simply called him difficult, someone you didn't want to cross. And then there was Tamika Molden, the mother. To the outside world, she was polite, reserved, and unassuming. A stay-at-home mom who kept to herself. But those who knew her described her as passive, almost invisible in her own home. She never challenged her husband's decisions, never stepped in to stop the chaos that was brewing around her. When police later asked her if she had known about the abuse happening under her roof, her response was silence. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just silence. And in cases like this, silence speaks volumes. Their son, Nathaniel Molden Jr., was 19 years old when the truth finally came to light. To his teachers, he was a high school dropout with no ambition, someone who barely attended classes before disappearing altogether. To his former classmates, he was something else entirely. Strange, manipulative, always finding a way to get what he wanted, even if it meant bending the truth. But at home, he was the oldest child, the one who should have been looking out for his younger sister. Instead, he preyed on her. For 2 years, he took advantage of someone who couldn't fight back, someone who lacked the ability to fully understand what was happening to her. And then there was her, the young woman at the center of this tragedy. For privacy reasons, her name won't be shared, but her story deserves to be told. She was 18 years old when she gave birth, but in many ways she was much younger than that. Born with an intellectual disability, she struggled with things most people take for granted: simple decision-making, understanding social cues, standing up for herself. Her IQ was just 49. She attended a special education program at the local high school where teachers worked with her to develop basic life skills. But she had no real social circle, no close friends, no one she could confide in. And in the one place where she should have been safe, her home, she was surrounded by people who failed her at every turn. Her brother, Nathaniel Jr., saw her not as family, but as something to be used. Her mother, Tamika, chose to look away rather than intervene. And her father, Nathaniel Sr., wasn't just an enabler. He was also a participant in the abuse. To outsiders, the Moldens appeared like any other family. But those who took a closer look saw something different. A household where the father controlled everything, a mother who lived in denial, and a son who manipulated, exploited, and ultimately destroyed the life of his sister. By the time law enforcement pieced together the full story, the damage had already been done. A child had been born into a world that should have never existed. A young woman had been robbed of a future she never had the chance to shape. And a family that kept its darkest secret hidden for years was about to be exposed to the world. But long before the police arrived at the Molden home, before DNA results confirmed what many feared, there were signs, warnings that something wasn't right inside that house. Clues that, if taken seriously, might have changed the course of this tragic story. The neighbors had seen things. They had heard things. Some nights, the sound of raised voices would echo down the street, shouting, arguments, things being slammed. One neighbor recalled hearing screaming, not from anger, but something else, something that felt different, unsettling. Another remembered how Nathaniel Jr. always seemed to be hovering around his sister, watching her, speaking to her in a way that felt unnatural. People noticed these things, but no one ever reported them. And behind closed doors, the situation was growing worse. In 2018, a teacher at the victim's high school noticed something troubling. The young girl, usually quiet and withdrawn but compliant, began to change. She became more anxious, more hesitant. There were times when she would flinch at sudden movements, as if expecting something to happen. When asked what was wrong, she would never answer directly. Her teacher suspected something was happening at home, something the young girl either couldn't explain or was too afraid to share. Following protocol, the teacher filed a report with social services, expressing concern for the girl's welfare. But nothing ever came of it. When a caseworker visited the Molden home, Tamika dismissed any concerns. She told them her daughter was simply different, that she had always been shy and reserved. And just like that, the case was closed. Years passed, and behind that front door, the situation escalated. By the time police finally uncovered the truth, they learned something even more disturbing. Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika had known. They had caught their son with their daughter multiple times. Each time their response was the same. They didn't call the police. They didn't seek counseling. They didn't move their son out of the home. Instead, they punished them both and expected it to stop. But it didn't. And when their daughter became pregnant, they were forced to make a choice. They could tell the truth, expose what had been happening under their roof, or they could hide it, hoping no one would ever ask the questions they didn't want to answer. They chose silence. But silence doesn't last forever. And soon the truth they tried to bury would be exposed to the world. It was July 2024 when the truth finally began to unravel. The call came into the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, DHS. An 18-year-old girl had just given birth at a local hospital in the village, Oklahoma. At first, it seemed like just another teenage pregnancy case. But it didn't take long for the nurses to realize something was very, very wrong. The young mother sat in her hospital bed, holding her newborn. She looked lost, uncertain, almost detached from the reality of what had just happened. A nurse gently approached her, asking the question that would set everything in motion. "Who is the father of your baby?" The girl hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on her mother, Tamika, who stood nearby. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My boyfriend." It was a simple answer, too simple. Because when pressed for more details, she couldn't remember his last name. She couldn't remember where he lived. She couldn't even describe how they met. The medical team exchanged uneasy glances. Something was off. The nurse asked again, this time more firmly. The girl's breathing quickened. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket. Then, under her breath, she whispered something that sent a chill through the room. "It might be my father." The nurse didn't wait. DHS was called immediately. Within the hour, caseworkers arrived at the hospital. They began their assessment, talking to the girl, trying to piece together the fragments of her story. But it wasn't easy. Her intellectual disability made communication difficult. She didn't fully understand what was happening. She didn't know why she was there. She didn't even fully grasp the concept of pregnancy. But one thing was clear. She was afraid, and her mother, Tamika, was covering something up. When questioned, Tamika repeated what her daughter had said earlier. It was a boyfriend, someone she met in the neighborhood. But when pressed for details, she hesitated. She didn't know the boy's name. She couldn't explain why she had never mentioned a boyfriend before. She refused to give investigators access to any messages or calls. The caseworkers didn't believe her. They turned their attention back to the young girl. She was scared, but slowly she began to open up. This time, it wasn't just about her brother. This time, she talked about her father. The young woman told investigators that Nathaniel Molden Sr., her father, had also abused her. Despite knowing that his son had been abusing her for years, he did nothing to stop it. Instead, he did the same. DHS caseworkers didn't wait. This wasn't just a case of neglect anymore. It was something much worse. Law enforcement was called in. At first, it was just speculation. There was no proof yet. But police needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. They obtained a court order for DNA testing. Samples were taken from the victim, the newborn baby, and every male in the household. This test would confirm the truth. Days later, the results arrived from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI. The test results were clear. The father of the baby was not a boyfriend. The father of the baby was not Nathaniel Molden Sr. The father of this child was her own brother, Nathaniel Molden. Junior law enforcement moved immediately. Arrest warrants were prepared. Because this case was no longer a question, it was a crime. And the people responsible were about to face justice. But the truth had finally caught up to them. And this time, there was no way out.
The teen and her mother, Tamika Molden, claimed a boyfriend was the baby's father. Police say the victim also told a DHS worker her father, Nathaniel Molden Sr., was the father.
Collected both DNA from the male members of the household, and it was confirmed through DNA testing at the OSBI to match the brother.
The morning of the arrest was quiet in the village, Oklahoma. The streets were still, the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. But inside the Molden home, chaos was about to erupt. Law enforcement arrived early, their presence announced by the sharp knock on the door. Nathaniel Molden Jr. was still groggy, woken up by his mother's panicked voice. "They're here," she said, her tone trembling. Officers moved in with purpose, their faces stern, their movements deliberate. "Nathaniel Molden Jr., you are under arrest," one of them declared. For a moment, Nathaniel Jr. froze, his eyes widened, his breath unsteady. Then the panic set in. "I didn't do nothing! I didn't do nothing!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he turned to his mother. "Mama, tell them! Tell them!" But Tamika stayed silent, her face pale, her hands trembling. Officers cuffed Nathaniel Jr., his protest turning to pleading. "Please, please don't take me," he begged. But the officers already had the evidence they needed. The DNA didn't lie. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika were also taken into custody. The scene was chaotic, with officers moving through the house, collecting evidence, and securing the scene. Body camera footage later released by the police showed the family's reactions. Nathaniel Sr.'s defiance, Tamika's quiet resignation, and Nathaniel Jr.'s desperate pleas. At the Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office, Nathaniel Jr. was placed in a small interrogation room. He sat with his arms crossed, refusing to make eye contact. The detective laid out the DNA report in front of him. "DNA from the male members of the household was tested," the detective said calmly, "and it was confirmed. You are the father of your sister's child." At first, Nathaniel Jr. denied everything. "I never touched her," he insisted, his voice shaky. But the silence in the room was heavy, pressing down on him. His hands started to tremble. "It wasn't like that," he finally said, his voice dropping. "She wanted it too." The detective's face remained cold. "She has the IQ of a child," he replied, his tone sharp. Nathaniel Jr. lowered his head into his hands, his voice barely audible. They knew, he muttered. The detective leaned forward. Who knew? Nathaniel Jr. exhaled sharply, then confessed. My parents. Meanwhile, in separate interrogation rooms, Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika were being questioned. When asked if they knew about the abuse, they both denied it. I had no idea, Nathaniel Sr. claimed, his voice firm. I would never let something like that happen. Tamika echoed his words. I didn't know, she insisted, her voice trembling. But detectives had already found the proof they needed. On Nathaniel Sr.'s phone, search history revealed disturbing queries. How to corrupt a DNA test? Do siblings have the same DNA? The timestamps showed these searches were made before the DNA results came back. He knew, and he had tried to cover it up. With this new evidence, police pieced together the full picture. Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika had known about the abuse all along. They had caught their son with their daughter multiple times, but chose to punish them instead of reporting it. When she became pregnant, they panicked, told her to lie, and tried to manipulate the system. Detectives returned to the interrogation rooms, this time not to ask questions but to lay down the facts. The silence was deafening. Nathaniel Jr. was charged with incest. Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika were charged with child neglect. The family that had spent years hiding their secrets was now exposed. This time, there was no escaping the truth. The investigation was over. The truth was out. But the consequences of what happened inside the Molden home would continue to unfold for years to come. As of October 2024, Nathaniel Molden Jr. was being held in the Oklahoma County Detention Center on a charge of incest. His parents, Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika, had also been arrested and charged with child neglect for their failure to protect their daughter. They had posted bail and were out of custody, awaiting their day in court. But their decision to stay silent, to ignore the abuse, and to actively cover it up had led to outrage from the community. Many believed they deserved a harsher punishment, not just for neglect, but for aiding in the ongoing abuse of their own daughter. The case had left the community in shock. People were angry, horrified, and questioning how something so horrific could have gone unnoticed for so long. For the young woman at the center of this tragedy, life would never be the same. She and her newborn baby had been placed in state custody, away from the family that had failed her. She was now under the care of social workers and medical professionals who would determine the best course of action for her recovery. But the question remained, could she ever truly recover? For years, she had lived in a home where she was not just neglected, but exploited. Her father, her brother, her own mother, they had all played a role in her suffering. Her ability to process what had happened to her was complicated by her intellectual disability, which made healing an even greater challenge. The child she had given birth to would also have a difficult road ahead. A baby born from abuse, deception, and betrayal. A child who would one day have questions about their origins, questions that might never have easy answers. This case had exposed a systemic failure. Reports indicated that there had been warning signs, neighbors who had heard disturbing noises at night, teachers who had expressed concerns about the young girl's well-being. Yet nothing had been done. The system had failed her. Her family had failed her. And now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that was never truly hers to begin with. As legal proceedings moved forward, one thing was certain. This case was far from over. Would Nathaniel Jr. take a plea deal, or would he face trial? Would Nathaniel Sr. and Tamika be held accountable for their role in covering up the abuse? Would the victim receive the care she so desperately needed? And most importantly, would justice be enough to bring closure to a life forever scarred by betrayal? Only time would tell. Some crimes shake a community to its core. But what happens when the very people meant to protect you are the ones who betray you the most? This was not just a case of abuse. It was a failure at every level. A young woman, vulnerable and defenseless, was trapped in a home where those responsible for her safety became the very ones who hurt her the most. So the question remains, how could this have been prevented? If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, speak up. Call for help. You never know whose life you might save. What do you think could have been done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this case important, subscribe to the channel for more deep investigative stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and always stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves.